Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at some really interesting research on THC and how it impacts the brain and how that all connects to opioid use.
Hmm. This new research on epigenetics, this is really changing the way we think about how substances like THC can, leave a mark on the brain, sort of.
Oh, it's not just about the genes themselves, then.
No, not really. It's more like think of epigenetics as it's about how experiences, even using substances, can change how your genes work, but not the actual DNA sequence itself. So
Okay.
you think about your genes, they are blueprint, right? But epigenetics, that's kind of like the software that controls how that blueprint is read and how it all gets expressed.
So it's kind of like THC is changing the software in our brains.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this recent study that came out in drug and alcohol dependence, and they looked at these epigenetic effects of cannabis and exocannabinoids, and they were really interested in seeing how these changes showed up in behavioral and emotional symptoms. The kind of stuff that you folks are dealing with every day.
Yeah, for sure. So, what can you tell me about these epigenetic mechanisms? Like what's happening at the molecular level?
So I think a good way to visualize this is picture these epigenetic mechanisms as like tiny little switches that can turn your genes on and off.
Okay.
And this study, they focused on this process called DNA methylation, where this methyl group, it attaches to a gene, and that can influence how the gene is expressed. So THC can actually come in and flip some of these switches, especially the ones that control how our brains respond to pleasure and distress.
Right. And those are obviously key areas when we're talking about therapy.
Absolutely, yeah.
So is this like THC kind of hijacking our brain's reward systems?
Yeah. Yeah, kinda. Kind of. You see, the study found that when someone's exposed to THC, it can change those methylation patterns in the DRD2 gene.
And what does that gene do?
That's the gene that's responsible for making a certain dopamine receptor.
Okay.
Dopamine, of course, that's a neurotransmitter, and it's a big deal in pleasure, in motivation, and reward.
Hmm.
And so when the activity of that gene gets messed up, it can throw off this delicate balance in the brain, and then that's when you see those cravings and the addictive behaviors.
Huh. So, there's this whole idea of the gateway drug theory, and it feels like this is really giving some scientific weight to that, especially when we're talking about THC and opioids.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely found in the study that exposure to THC, whether it's prenatal or during adulthood, it might make someone more vulnerable to becoming addicted to opioids later on.
Wow, that's concerning.
Yeah.
How might that connection work?
Well, they saw these changes in how available the dopamine receptors were. Particularly, there were fewer dopamine receptor type 2s, after exposure to THC.
Right.
And they also found that PNK was upregulated. That's a gene that's all about how we feel pain and how we feel pleasure. So what this is suggesting is that THC might actually be sort of priming the brain so that it's more susceptible to opioids, and it does that by changing the reward system and how we perceive pain.
So does this mean that edibles or vaping have different effects on the brain than smoking?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, I was just thinking, our listeners are probably seeing all different kinds of ways that people are using cannabis these days.
And most of the research out there, including this study, they've really focused on smoking. But with more and more people using edibles and vaping and tinctures, I think it's really important to figure out how those different ways of consuming it might be influencing, those epigenetic effects of THC.
Yeah, that makes sense. We definitely need to stay on top of all these changes in how people are using cannabis so that we can help our clients better.
Absolutely.
Seems like the way it's consumed, that could be a really important piece of this whole puzzle.
Absolutely. The other thing that this study is showing us is that it really matters how old someone is when they first start using, especially when we're talking about teenagers. They found that if someone's exposed to THC during peripuberty, that's this really critical time for brain development. It can have these lasting impacts on the genes related to the cannabinoid system and the dopamine system in the prefrontal cortex.
So this is a time when the brain's still being built,
Yeah.
and THC could could really mess with that process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that helps us make decisions and control our impulses and regulate our emotions, all these really crucial functions that can be impacted by early exposure to THC. That's why it's so important to step in early, especially for younger people.
Wow. This is a lot to think about, but it's really important information for anybody who's working with people who are struggling with substance use, and especially THC.
Right.
It feels like we're finally starting to understand the biology
Hmm.
behind what we've been seeing in our practices for years now.
Right. Thinking about all this biology, it makes you wonder how these epigenetic changes that we've been talking about, how those actually end up showing up as the behavioral and emotional symptoms that you're seeing as addiction counselors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about some of my clients, who struggle with anxiety and depression, and I'm wondering, could that be connected to their THC use?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, the research shows a really strong connection there between being exposed to THC and having an increased risk for both anxiety and depression. And remember how we were talking about how THC can mess with dopamine signaling. Well, that same disruption can throw off the balance of other neurochemicals too, like serotonin and norepinephrine, and those play a big role in regulating our moods and keeping us, emotionally stable.
So it's not just dopamine that's being affected then.
Right, right. It's like this whole system that gets thrown off. And it's not even just about those immediate effects, like feeling anxious or down after you use THC, but this study suggests that these changes at the epigenetic level, they could make people more likely to develop some longer-term mental health problems too. It's almost like THC is leaving this imprint on how the brain handles emotions.
Huh. Yeah, it really makes you think about the long term, especially for our clients who might have started using THC when they were younger. It feels like early intervention is more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, when you think about all the potential long-term consequences, especially for teenagers, whose brains are still developing, it's clear that we've got to be doing everything we can to prevent this and to intervene as early as possible.
Now, when the one thing that a lot of addiction counselors are dealing with is psychosis. Is there a connection between using THC and that?
That's a tough one. It's really complicated and the research is still coming in, but there are studies out there that do suggest there could be a link between THC use and a higher risk of developing psychosis, especially for folks who might already have a genetic predisposition for it. It's
Okay.
it's not like a simple cause and effect thing.
Right.
But it does look like THC might be a factor for some people.
So it's not that THC is directly causing psychosis, but it could be increasing the risk for those who are already vulnerable.
Exactly, exactly. And what's interesting is that the research shows THC can actually impact the methylation patterns in some genes that are involved in the development of psychosis. Like there's this one gene called the AKT1 gene,
Okay.
and changes to that gene could be one of the ways that THC influences that risk.
So we're seeing those same epigenetic changes we were talking about before actually affecting genes that are linked to psychosis.
Right, exactly. It all goes back to how THC can change how our genes work. But it's important to remember that psychosis is complex, right? I
Wow.
mean, there's genetics, there's environmental stressors, there are other mental health conditions that can be underlying. So THC is likely just one piece of that whole puzzle, not the whole picture.
Yeah, yeah. It's important that we don't oversimplify things, as addiction counselors,
Yeah.
because it is really complex.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody's experience with cannabis is going to be different.
Right.
And we need to remember that with each client. This research gives us some great clues about what's happening biologically, but ultimately your clinical judgment and your experience, that's what's essential to give someone the right care and treatment.
Right. Right. It sounds like we need to be more individualized and holistic in our approach.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about understanding the individual, their genetics, their environment, their experiences. And as we learn more about all these epigenetic mechanisms, we might even be able to develop new therapies that can actually target those specific changes in the genes.
Wow, that's exciting. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Mm.
there was another study that was in this deep dive that I wanted to talk about. It was focused on adolescence, and they were looking at this specific epigenetic biomarker that's related to smoking, like tobacco and cannabis.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that study is particularly relevant these days,
Yeah.
because we're seeing so many changes in how adolescents are using substances. It's really important that we have, good tools to be able to monitor and understand all those trends.
Yeah, and what I thought was interesting about that study was that they were looking at this biomarker called CG0575921. It's this DNA methylation site, and it can actually detect if someone's been exposed to tobacco smoke and cannabis smoke.
Right.
Which is really useful, because these days adolescents are exposed to so many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got e-cigarettes, you've got all these different forms of cannabis. So having a biomarker like this that can pick up on multiple substances, it can really give us a much better understanding of what they've been exposed to.
Yeah, and the researchers, they found that this biomarker was pretty accurate at showing, if someone had been exposed to smoke. And it lined up with some of those traditional measures like serum cottonine levels for tobacco.
Right.
But it also found some people who wouldn't have been picked up by those older methods.
Yeah, which suggests that this epigenetic biomarker might actually be, even more sensitive.
Right.
And that could be really helpful when you're working with adolescents who might not, be so open about telling you what they've been using.
That's true. Yeah, teenagers, they face a lot of different pressures and stigmas around substance use. So
Right.
so having these more sensitive tools, that could really be a game changer when it comes to assessment and intervention.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that study, it didn't just stop there. They also looked at how the environment and social factors might be affecting this biomarker.
Okay.
And it turned out that things like having friends or family who smoke, that was linked to higher levels of the CG0557591 methylation.
So the social environment matters even at this epigenetic level.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it just shows how important it is to understand the big picture,
Right.
It's not just about the individual's choices, but it's about your peers, their family, their community. All of that contributes to how vulnerable they are to addiction.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to be thinking more holistically about prevention and education too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that study also found that adolescents tend to view cannabis users in a more positive light than cigarette smokers, and they were more willing to try cannabis, and that really shows how important it is to have these education efforts that are specifically targeting those changing perceptions about different substances.
Yeah, we need to be meeting teenagers where they are, and acknowledge what's going on in their lives and give them accurate information and support that's actually relevant to them. And this research, this really gives us some good data to build on.
Exactly, exactly. And another really interesting thing about that study is what it tells us about the potential long-term consequences of those early epigenetic changes. So the researchers, they followed the adolescents for 3 years, and those epigenetic modifications, they were still there after all that time.
So being exposed to smoke
Yeah.
early on, whether it's tobacco or cannabis, that can have these lasting effects on gene expression.
Right.
Wow. It really shows that the choices that adolescents are making today, those can have some pretty big consequences down the road.
Absolutely. And it just highlights the importance of the role that you play as addiction counselors and in helping young people make those healthier choices and supporting them in their recovery.
Yeah.
This research, it really underscores this whole idea of how our environment, our genes, and our behavior, it's all intertwined.
It's a reminder that we all need to be more mindful, I think, about the choices that we're making and the environments that we're creating and the support that we're giving to people who are struggling with addiction.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of support, that final study in this deep dive, it looks at the possibility of using epigenetic therapies to actually address some of these changes that we've been talking about.
Okay, now we're getting into some interesting stuff.
Mhm.
So is this where science fiction meets reality?
Kind of, researchers are looking into these really cutting edge techniques that could potentially reverse or even change those epigenetic alterations that happen because of substance use. I mean, this could open up some really amazing new possibilities for addiction recovery.
I'm all ears. Tell me more about this research.
So this study, it was published in Current Opinion in Neurobiology, and it really delves into this technique called locus-specific neuroepigenetic editing. And what that means is it's using these engineered molecules that can target specific genes and actually modify their epigenetic marks. So it's kind of like like precision surgery for the epigenome.
Wow. That's incredible. So what are some of the tools that they're using to do this editing?
Well, they're using things like zinc finger proteins and CRISPR-Cas9, and these tools they act kind of like molecular scissors,
Okay.
and they can bind to specific DNA sequences, which allows scientists to manipulate how the gene is expressed, with incredible accuracy.
Wow. So they can basically override those epigenetic changes that might have happened because of using THC.
Exactly, exactly. And you can imagine what that could mean for treating addiction, right? I mean, it's huge. We could develop therapies that go right to the genes and the pathways that are messed up by being exposed to THC, and potentially even restore the brain's reward circuitry back to how it's supposed to work.
That's amazing. But this all sounds so futuristic. Is this something that we'll be seeing anytime soon, or is this, years away?
Well, it's still pretty early on,
Right.
and there are a lot of challenges to work through, but the progress is really exciting. It's a very promising area of research, and I think it really could revolutionize how we approach addiction treatment in the future.
So there's hope on the horizon.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about understanding addiction better, but actually about maybe even reversing some of the damage that's been done.
Exactly, exactly. And as research into the epigenome continues, I think we're going to find even more possibilities for interventions that can target those root causes of addiction and help people, really recover for good.
This deep dive has been packed with information.
It
And
has.
I know it's a lot to take in, but it's so valuable for anyone who's working with people who are struggling with addiction.
Absolutely. I mean, we've really explored this intricate world of epigenetics and how THC affects how our genes are expressed, and we've even touched on the potential for new therapies in the future.
Yeah.
And it's all about giving you the knowledge and the tools that you need to really understand and support your clients better.
It feels like we're moving towards a more informed and hopeful way of treating addiction.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to step back and look at what all this means for addiction counselors on a practical level.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about, how THC affects the brain, and we've
Mhm.
been looking at it through this lens of epigenetics. But what does it all mean for addiction counselors who are out there working with people who are struggling with THC and opioid use?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that addiction, it's not just a lack of willpower.
Yeah.
It's not a moral failing. What this research is showing us is that using substances and especially THC, it can really have a big impact on our biology. It actually changes the way our gains work.
So we're talking about like a real physical change in the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to understand that when we're thinking about addiction counseling, it's about recognizing that each person has their own vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And it's about understanding the biology behind it all and then tailoring the treatment plan to fit that person.
It seems like this research is really challenging a lot of the traditional ideas about addiction.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And it's showing us that we need to have a more compassionate approach, an approach that's based on science. For example, if we know that someone who's been exposed to THC early on might be more likely to get addicted to opioids later, then we need to be really careful about screening for opioid use in clients who have a history of using cannabis.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's especially important when you're working with adolescents, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, their brains are still developing.
Right.
So those early experiences with THC, they can have a much bigger impact. Early intervention is key.
Mm.
You've got to talk to your young clients about what could happen down the road if they keep using THC.
Okay.
Give them the facts about how it affects their brain, and really important, address any mental health issues that they might be dealing with that could be contributing to their substance use.
So it's about meeting them where they're at, understanding their struggles, and giving them the tools and the support that they need to make better choices.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive also really shows how important it is to take a holistic approach to addiction counseling.
Yeah.
It's not just about the substance use itself, but you got to think about those bigger social and environmental factors too that play a role.
So things like family dynamics and peer pressure and community norms, all that.
Exactly. Exactly. Those things can make someone more vulnerable to addiction, and trauma-informed care is so important here. If you understand how things like adverse childhood experiences or chronic stress, how those can lead to these epigenetic changes that increase the risk of addiction, well then you can be more compassionate and you can treat people more effectively.
So it's about connecting the dots between the biology, the person's life experiences, and their social environment.
Exactly, exactly. And as we learn more about these epigenetic mechanisms, we might even be able to develop new therapies that can target those specific changes. Like we talked about neuroepigenetic editing earlier.
Yeah, that was really interesting. The idea that we might actually be able to reverse some of the damage, at the molecular level. That's pretty amazing. Gives me hope for the future of addiction treatment.
Me too. Me too. It's a field that's moving really fast and the more you stay up to date on all these advancements, the more it's going to help your clients in the end.
That's that's what we're all about here on the deep dive.
Absolutely.
Giving you the knowledge and the insights that you need to stay ahead of the curve and provide the best care possible.
Couldn't have said it better myself. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What if, by understanding all this about epigenetics, we could not only treat addiction, but actually prevent it from happening in the first place?
That's a great question. And it really shows just how powerful this research is. How much potential it has to change people's lives.
Right.
So keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for your clients.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There's a whole community of researchers and clinicians and advocates out there all working together to figure out this complex thing we call addiction and finding solutions that actually work.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of epigenetics and THC.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking and maybe even a little bit inspiring. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.